It takes a very special person to be able to get into that. But the mudras with the hands are very interesting, and I think people should be aware that the dark mudras exist. The dark mudras are hand gestures, specific forms that your mind will translate through the reading process to a word that can actually trigger itself as a command if you've been linguistically programmed. In the sense that if you've got a pre-hypnotized suggestion in your brain from watching Fox News too much, then somebody could use a mudra, catch on to that particular whirling bit of neurons in your brain and command you to go there, and you would never even know it because they wouldn't express the command verbally. They would do it in the form of a mudra, hand gestures, series of them actually, linked up, done in a specific way. They can also use shadow, by the way, light and shadow, be careful of that. To actually form the same symbols, and your mind will take these in through the visual cortex, in through the eyes. They'll reverse them from right to left, top to bottom, and present them as a grapheme in the visual cortex of the brain, way in the back of the brain. And a lot of your brain energy is then trapped up in decoding these, and it gets energized, but it also sucks energy away from conscious thought and can be a distractant. As well as a command, so be aware of that. And the grapheme, once it's established in your brain, then actually, because of the nature of the grapheme, it's not just a random image, it's actually a letter or a word or a command, and is read that way by your brain, then the grapheme will flop over and become a phoneme within the linguistic center of your brain, which is usually located below the left eye and slightly back of the sinus cavities in that area. Now, parallel with the left eye and behind the sinus cavities. So here you have a situation where people do hand gestures. Your brain is reading it as though you were reading a giant placard that says, become hypnotized, go to sleep, let me steal your watch. Yeah, there are people that use it at that level. And you'll respond that way. You'll become hypnotized, you'll go to sleep, you won't see anything, they'll let you, and you'll let them steal your watch, and you'll be quite happy. And because of the way that it was all done, you'll just maybe even be totally unaware of it until several hours later you'll think your watch has been misplaced, or then you'll realize it's stolen, and yet you're literally hours away from the scene at which it occurred. So these mudras exist. There's ways to guard yourself against them. I'm seeing more and more indicators that they're using them in TV. I don't watch TV, but you can actually see some of it in the shadow play that comes out in a television reflected into a mirror that is seen through a sheet of paper. And it's an experiment. It's an interesting experimental way to catch subliminals, because the sharp subliminal lines of the word they're usually using a yellow or a whitish font on a black background, or the reverse, light background, dark font, but in either case the sharp edges show up through the paper, and you don't really, and the paper has a tendency, if it's the right kind of waxed paper, has a tendency to fog all the other images, so your eye doesn't even really see the people involved or whatever. You just all of a sudden see these flashes of the subliminals coming out. As I say, it's an interesting technique, but don't spend days staring at it to catch it, because you have to train your eyes to do it. And I use Vortex, my reading software, so I've trained my eyes to catch very rapid flickers. Because basically that's what it does. So anyway, back to the mudras. You got people using these dark mudras against us, and it just may be of interest to educate yourself about them. And you're now going to start seeing, I think the next thing is they'll start using colors, the color mudras against you. There are certain colors that can be used to actually cause you to be basically self-hypnotizing. They don't work ubiquitously. The color thing is not as powerful as the mudras, because the mudras are more or less common language with the human brain, whereas the colors are very specific to the body type. So some people would be affected by a particular kind of a blue and others wouldn't. They would need to have a green or an orange or something. So they can't use it in a broadcast manner as effectively as they can the mudras. I think that'll be their next stage as they start clamping down on thought here. They're going to really ratchet up on all these tricky little bits. So last thing here in our test, I know we're about 20 minutes now, and I didn't want to take up too much of the time, is that I want to talk about stargates, which is part of my little bloop theory. The stargate is just there as a reminder of STG, because excuse me, the little bloop theory is the antithesis to the Big Bang. The Big Bang, it comes to the idea that there was this little P-shaped thing that exploded and all of space existed, and then there was a few bits of atoms around, and we've been filling up this big empty envelope of space ever since it happened 12 or 13 billion years ago. And that's bullshit. It doesn't happen that way. It never did. One of the premises of active, effective science is that whatever you postulate can't be the God in the machine. It can't be a one-time event. It can't be a miracle. It's got to exist now. It's got to have been part of existence at all times and can't have ceased as a process. So if you're going to tell me that, you know, hydrogen grows legs and walks and talks and spits in public and is a problem, the hydrogen molecule, then, well, it better be happening right now if that's your premise. You can't say it happened once and never since. So this is basically one of the premises against the idea of external saviors and the idea of the Messiah. It's a bunch of bullshit. In any event, so the little bloop theory is that there's 22 trillion times a second. There's this pulse that comes on. Well, sorry, the little bloop theory starts out this way. Instead of the Big Bang, there was a single atom that formed. So we agree on that. There was this little tiny thing that occurred. And in my case, I'm saying it was a negative form, a negative ionized form of hydrogen that occurred first. And this actually occurred about, my way of calculating, about 3 to 6 seconds into the creation of the materium. And from then on, it's been continuous, and I'll explain in a second how rapidly it's occurring and so on. But here's the deal. The materium is formed by this pulse of energy that goes beyond time and space and travels instantly from the middle of the universe to every single thing, all the galaxies in the universe, to the center of them, then to all of the solar systems, then to all of the stars in the solar systems, all the planets, all the dust, all the people, all the dogs, all the cats, all of the frogs, toads, lizards, and everything else, plants, etc. And this pulse is, let's just say it's the yin energy. And this yin energy pulse travels instantaneously, and it creates universe. In our minds, because our minds don't work very fast, we see it as solid. But really, it's a series of flashes, like one might think of as a strobe light. Only, and you know that weird effect if you've ever seen it. But it's like a strobe light going 22 trillion times a second, so there is no weird effect. You actually think it's solid, because anytime you reach out with your hand, which is actually made out of energy, and has a feedback loop made out of energy, it touches something that it thinks is solid, but it's actually made out of energy, but it's energy touching energy, and it feeds back to you, and you think it's solid because of this. And also because they've lied to you, that is to say the education system, that says that atoms are this persistent thing that hang around forever. Not the case. So in my understanding of how the materium came about, and the materium is the place where matter exists, this is where our brains are currently operating, and my tongue's flapping in my teeth to create airwaves that you guys are going to, the machinery's going to interpret into a digital signal processor, going to present it to you in a form that your ears are going to think is actual sound. All of this is an illusion. It's all energy, and so many levels that we can't even really discuss it effectively, because it would take all day. But let's talk about the energy that creates it all. That's this 22 trillion times a second pulse. There's also this 22 trillion times a second pause, in which the energy sags or disappears for that 22 trillionth of a second. And thus, when it recreates itself, things can move because they don't jam into themselves, so to speak, and we don't leave a trail of ourself behind, because it is we live in a universe of continuous creation and destruction. We did not have an initial creation of the universe. Thus, there is no creator of the universe as they would have you understand it. There was no being that sat out there and spat the universe out that way. The materium exists within the materium is the universe and all the other universes, and this is created through this pulse that happens continuously, continuously creating the materium and continuously destroying it so things can move, atoms and everything else. It obviously has to create itself and destroy itself faster than our ability to measure the fastest thing in terms of the universe. In other words, if we're going to have an atom that we say has an electron that spins around at, a billion times a second, well, then we'd better have our flashy creation of universe faster than a billion times a second. And I arrived at the notion that it was 22 trillion times a second, because that's basically 3 and a smudge times greater and plus 1 or times 1 magnitude over Avogadro's number, based on the relative volume for and a certain temperature and pressure for negatively ionized hydrogen, which I did a few years back when I didn't have much else to do and I'd had a saw go through my legs, so I was kind of confined for a couple of days. Anyway, so the little bloop theory is that these 22 trillion times a second lines, this pulse of energy bounced off itself and created itself. Now, in the very first part of universe consisted, the materium consisted only of that single atom. And it never blew up. It never created a giant space or anything like that. It doesn't work that way. That little atom, hydrogen ion, created itself, and it brought with it the space that it needed to exist in. It also brought with it the gravity it needs and the time that it needs to exist. These are part of the attributes of material reality that come along when it creates itself. So time is not independent of the creation of this particular hydrogen atom, nor is gravity, nor is the space. They are all concurrently created when the atom creates itself and pops into the materium. And it pops into the materium. The very first one popped into the materium when, in my estimation, when the 22 trillion times a second lines had crashed into themselves for about 3 to 6 seconds. That would have given, I think, sufficient mass, if you will, energetically, to have caused that first anu, the first indivisible unit, as the Buddhists call it, to begin to work its way through from the energy realm into the material realm. And on this side, that thing is an atom, which I think was a negatively ionized hydrogen atom. So that's how it happened. The very first atom created itself, and it goes bloop, and it pops into the universe, and that's all there is this one little atom. But because of the nature of that pulse that was behind it, and creating it and destroying it continuously, because as soon as it creates itself, it's destroying itself and creating itself in the materium 22 trillion times a second. But as the instant that happened, it was also joined by another atom going bloop. And then, so there were 2 atoms in universe. And then there were, the instant that happened, there were 3 and 4 and so on. Because the difference, in my estimation, between the very first atom creating itself in the 3rd to 6th second and the size of the universe 1 second later is massively huge. But it has nothing to do with a Big Bang, just that there were so many bazillions of atoms creating themselves so simultaneously that all of materium just started growing, and it's been growing ever since. And we have evidence of that, the way that the dark matter, so to speak, is pushing, those are the anu, the indivisible units, are pushing everything aside, and the universe is theoretically expanding. Now, the Big Bang would say that we're expanding inside to the infinite limit of the infinite envelope that existed, and that's where all the space is. The little bloop theory says, bullshit. It's still infinite, and it can expand infinitely, and there's no need to even envision an envelope, because each atom brings with it its own envelope of the appropriate size. Thus, we have the ability to have a uranium atom pop in with 235 chunks of material pretending to exist at its nucleus, versus the hydrogen atom with 1 chunk of material pretending to exist. And yet they would require a different space when they come in, and of course they bring different space when they come in. They also bring in different gravity and different time, and this was the point of this particular discussion, was to bring up those 2 elements as regards the little bloop theory, and to let you know how they work. So it can be easily seen that space will grow orderly, infinitely, each time a new atom creates itself. When an atom disappears, it takes the space that it occupied out. But atoms have a longer lifespan relative to the history of new atoms being created than they do destructive history. Therefore, the universe grows as opposed to apparently shrinking. But you could also easily imagine that if the process decided to reverse itself, it would just start sucking up the atoms in the reverse of that little bloop, and you would get this effect of the universe decreasing. And it could be orderly as well, needn't be violent in any regard. And so the anu, the indivisible unit, are out there creating themselves and popping into existence as they are required to, based on the templates that are out there within that pulse. And that's a whole other discussion, is the templates component. But in any event, when the atoms come on in, they not only bring the space they need, they bring in the gravity they need. This makes sense because, therefore, if the hydrogen atom knows how heavy it needs to be, and the uranium atom knows how heavy it needs to be, so they bring those along with them. According to the ancient Sanskrit understanding, the yogic understanding, each and every one of these anu, each and every one of the indivisible units, has the capacity to bring in up to 66,000 attributes with it, including things like gravity and time. Now, all of them bring in gravity and time, or in the main they do. We've got machinery, the Large Hadron Collider, that are trying to create or force the